My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing 13 Days, Kevin Costner's political thriller about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I got a bad feeling about what's going on in there.
So I think we have to issue pre-invasion orders for our forces.
There's no choice. It's going to cost lives anyway we go.
We're talking about possible nuclear war.
We gotta be the smart guys. We lock them in a room, we come up with some solutions.
The full spectrum of airstrikes is minimum response the Joint Chiefs will accept. No. There is more than one option.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me from California, thanks to the miracle of Zoom, is Jim Robinson, who can do a better Boston accent than anyone in this movie. Don't worry, Jim. I won't make you prove it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, Gary. It's been years since I've packed the car and have it yet.
Okay.
But here we are talking about Kennedys again. Two Kennedys. You must be in hog heaven.
Oh, gee. I
That
know.
was
I
my
know.
accent.
Yeah, I know. Well, not only am I complaining about the Kennedy's accent, but I'm complaining about the Kevin Costner's accent, which is completely different, of course, because, as you know, the Kennedys don't have a Boston accent. This movie is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one of the scariest things that happened in our lifetime. I was in third grade at the time, but I don't remember it at all. Do you?
I definitely remember it. We had an under the desk drill in our class, and I was in the Cub Scouts. And one of the exercises that we did in the Cub Scouts was in our uniforms, we all had to, one at a time, get down on a carpet and roll around as if that would shake all of the radioactive dust off of us. It was kind of naive, but absolutely. I remember it. I'm surprised you don't.
I'm surprised I don't either, because I have so many memories about the Kennedys. I have no recollection at all about hiding under desks or rolling around or anything.
Well, I even remember a conversation with my father. And my father was the type of person that was always, no problem, no problem, no problem, to everything that came up in our family. And I went up to him and I said, are we going to have a nuclear war? And he said, I hope not, which was very uncharacteristic. And I got really scared.
People in our generation talk a lot about where they were when Kennedy was shot, but I've never heard anyone talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, was maybe not as shocking. I wonder if the Kennedys actually did too good a job of downplaying what for the public and not scaring the public, because if you think about it, I don't know why people weren't like racing out of cities and going to the Middle West or something, but everyone seemed to stay in place and just hope for the best.
Well, there was the craze to build bomb shelters and load up on supplies, things like that. He did make a nationwide televised speech, which weren't very usual in those days. So
I will say that my parents did talk about getting a bomb shelter for the house. And there was a conversation about whether we should get a swimming pool or a bomb shelter. As if, they were both equally appealing options. Well, I don't really even remember learning about it until I think I was in high school. And it's like this slow moving realization about that happening. And I remember thinking like, what? How come no one ever told me anything about this?
Well, I realized after watching this movie that I thought I knew everything about it, but I didn't. I mean, I actually thought that the crisis was over when that first Russian ship turned around.
Right.
And it wasn't by a long shot.
So
and of course, I never knew that somebody was actually killed, an American.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that either. Did you see that the Missiles of October with William Devane? Yeah.
No, I never saw that.
I saw that. So that kind of is, it follows the same plot pretty closely as I remember, although I haven't seen it in 30 years. But it did make a big impression on me. But it's the same basic premise. What are your recollections about Khrushchev?
I remember him coming to America. I think he went to Disneyland.
Yeah.
So I vaguely remember those kind of, you know, brief fleeting images because, we were kids.
Yeah.
And I remember him as being the bad guy, the
Yeah.
boorish bad guy who took his shoe off, and also one who was very easy to parody.
Right.
So when the man from Uncle did a show where a Khrushchev kind of character arrived in the US, they had that character take his shoe off and bang it on a table.
It's a funny thing. I don't think he gets the historic weight that he kind of deserves. He was very, very omnipresent in our lives. I mean, people were talking about Khrushchev all the time as the bad guy and the villain, and then he got overthrown by the Russian, by the, you know, Brezhnev and his guys, and he just sort of
Maybe in part,
disappeared.
yeah, maybe in part because of the
Oh
Cuban
yeah,
Missile Crisis.
absolutely. So, can I just do a quick summary of what the movie's all about?
Sure.
Basically the title says it all. The movie covers the period in October 1962 between the US discovery of Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba and the Russians' agreement to remove them 13 days later. The story is told through the eyes of Ken O'Donnell, President Kennedy's political aide and close advisor. We see the famous deliberations among Kennedy's foreign policy and military leaders, most of whom are trigger happy, and they want to bomb Cuba immediately. The Kennedys struggle to avoid nuclear war and find various ways to delay airstrikes and an invasion, even though each branch of the service passive aggressively tries to bring the crisis to a boil. They eventually get the military to agree to a naval blockade, which buys a few days, as well as back channel communications with the Russians, which buys a few more. But every day feels like it might be the last one before a nuclear holocaust. Throughout the process, Ken O'Donnell dispenses sarcastic, Boston accented wisdom, defends the Kennedys from the foreign policy establishment, and bucks them up when they need it. Eventually, Bobby Kennedy goes to the Russian embassy, talks to the Soviet ambassador, and tells them that if the Russians remove the missiles, we will promise not to invade Cuba, and that we will also remove our obsolete missiles from Turkey within 6 months as long as they don't tell the world we are doing this. The Russians blink, take the deal, and save civilization. So that's it. What do you think?
I think that's pretty good. The thing to emphasize stylistically and artistically is what you pointed out about the role of Ken O'Donnell. It's all seen through his eyes.
Right.
And we learn about his wife, not about the Kennedys' wives, his kids, not the Kennedys' kids, his Catholic faith and the role that played, not the Kennedys' Catholicism, his concerns about Armageddon, his workload, his angst. It's all through that filter.
And of course, Kevin Costner plays Ken O'Donnell, who was his Kennedy's scheduling secretary, which doesn't sound like a very important job, but maybe in the Kennedy White House, it was. I don't know. I mean, he's the one who decides who goes to Jackie's parties and who goes in to see the president and that kind of thing. And I guess he really was a important person. I looked up the the cast for the Missiles of October, and to see who the stars were and so forth. And Ken O'Donnell actually does appear in that movie, but he's the 30th ranked person in the cast. So obviously a completely different different emphasis.
Well, one of the things I did after watching this movie was reread the pertinent chapters in one of my favorite Kennedy books, which is specifically about his years in the White House, almost, month by month.
Right.
It's by Richard Reeves, President Kennedy Profile of Power. And
Okay.
he does a TikTok of the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kenny O'Donnell hardly appears in it at all. He did have access to the XCOM meetings. That was the small group that Kennedy anointed to guide him through the crisis. But it was really in the TikTok version in Reeves. It was really Sorensen and Bobby, the ununiformed, non-cabinet officials that advised JFK. So, but Reeves also points out on other occasions that O'Donnell was an important aide. I mean, we've been in political operations in situations like this where there can be certain aides to the top guy who do everything from write a major speech to worry about who's going to ride in what car. There are aides like that in political settings. And so I think there's no question O'Donnell was an important, close aide, but his role in the crisis itself, that's very, very much open to debate.
Right. Okay.
How did the movie do?
You know, it's interesting. The movie got generally good reviews. The Washington Post, for example, said, for a drama that's obliged to turn on ideas, memos, nuances, and situation room chatter, rather than the more visceral visual fare of most Hollywood thrillers, 13 Days is tremendously effective. So it got pretty exceptional reviews across the board, but the public didn't seem to buy it. The production budget for this movie was $80 million, and the domestic box office only reached 34 million, and there's probably another 34 million international. So it was, a financial failure.
Another one of our presidential movies losing money.
I
Maybe
know.
you and I are the only ones that like them.
I know. We should revisit this at some point. The only movie that we've seen so far that was a hit was Lincoln. But this is,
Right.
This ranked number 71 among U.S. movies in 2001. The top movie that year was the first Harry Potter movie with a box office of 288, again, versus 34. The other movies that year were Shrek, Monsters, Inc., Rush Hour 2, and The Mummy Returns. And I have to admit that I had never thought about this movie once since it came out. I had completely forgotten that it existed, and if we weren't like just sort of accidentally start looking around for movies about presidents, I don't think I ever would have seen it.
Well, I have to wonder if it were released 2 years later than it was, if it would have done better, because in the year 2000 things were kind of copacetic on the world stage. I mean, George W. Bush ran and won on the idea that we needed to turn inward, have a more humble foreign policy. And what if it had come out right after 9/11, where we were then in a global war on terror? Everyone was looking around the world at the threats facing us. It might have done better. And by way of illustration, 2 months after 9/11, the show 24 premiered on television,
Right.
which basically every season had a different world is ending Armageddon theme. And that was very popular.
Well, I think you make a very good point. The timing was wrong for sure. This cat came about 10 years after the collapse of the USSR. And I don't think people really wanted to revisit that era at that point. It's like after disasters happened, people kind of just want to forget it. And, I also think it suffered from being a thriller in which the ending is known. I mean, we obviously
Right.
blow up the world.
But there were documentary reasons why a fresh film was warranted. For one thing, the tapes that JFK made of his ex-com sessions, he secretly recorded those meetings, remembering how Nixon was vilified for daring to secretly record meetings in his White House. It turns out Kennedy did. And that provided a lot of the material for this movie. And also there were a lot of documents and historical records being uncovered and revealed from the former Soviet Union. So there was fresh material that shed some nuance, if not new light on things.
Did you like the movie?
I did. I thought the telling of the missile crisis story was gripping. It was dramatic. I thought the back and forth interplay of the military scenes on the high seas in the Caribbean, and then you quickly go back to tension in the White House Situation Room or wherever it was. from men in uniforms to men in suits. I thought that was really well done. It was kind of refreshing, as scary as the episode was, to see a movie where the good guys and the bad guys were pretty clear. And frankly, it was refreshing to see a president, any president, treated as a good guy, even though it was a Kennedy. Sorry, Gary. So, so I think that you had to be really bad filmmakers and bad scriptwriters to screw up this story, and they didn't screw up. They almost did, though. That's a spoiler alert for later.
I also liked, I was really surprised at how much I liked it. I thought it was extremely well directed, and taught, and there wasn't a lot of fat on there. I have some quibbles about the history myself. Uh, but I thought that I thought it was great. I mean, who would you recommend this movie to?
Um, I would say history buffs, Kennedy nostalgists, um, people who are interested in learning about how what things were like in a nuclear confrontation age, especially given current events, where we're kind of replaying those fears. It's a little overblown. People are using those fears for their own agendas on both sides of the Ukraine situation, but it does have some relevance in terms of that. So that's who I'd recommend it to.
Yeah, I agree, and I'd also recommend it to anyone who just likes a good drama, a tense drama.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it was. You don't even really need to be a history buff to like this movie. I guess it helps a little bit, um, to know. Although if you're a history buff and you already know the TikTok and the who's who, maybe that would be a problem. It would just seem a little, so maybe not knowing that much actually helps.
I think there were also some gee whiz kind of moments in there where you said, "Oh, that's interesting." The way that the options were laid out, the framing of it. So you had LeMay on one side, General LeMay, the warmonger. You had Adlai Stevenson on the other side, who self-described himself as the coward, and Kennedy sort of in the middle, which kind of rings true based on the history I know. I think they probably characterized the saber rattling generals and military a little bit, but it's interesting to see them in that role because today it seems like it's the opposite. The civilian leadership, at least in recent times, are more ready to go to war, and the military men are more reticent. And also the role of John Scally, the role of a journalist in bringing the deal, the fundamentals of a deal to the White House, which was really historically accurate. Just to see the role the press played is a kind of a wow moment.
Yeah, just for those who haven't seen the movie, John Scally was an ABC reporter who was friends with, or well, not really friends, but was an associate, or not even associate, he had a source who was the head of the KGB in Washington, who brought a proposal uh, from this, supposedly from Khrushchev to
Yeah, it was
this
like a back channel.
back channel, classic back channel. So they famously met at the this hotel in Washington, which is still dining out on the fact that this meeting took place there, and he brought the message to the Kennedys, and you're right, it was the outline of the deal. That, although again, what surprised me is that even after this deal was basically cut, the crisis went on for days and days and days after that.
Right,
I mean, I
right.
thought that was all over, but it didn't. You mentioned earlier that it was good to see a movie where it was clear who the good guys and the bad guys are, but I'm not really sure that's the case because in this movie, the military is kind of the bad guys. I mean, they're just itching to start bombing. And they're constantly undermining Kennedy by trying to turn every little situation into a bigger crisis.
Yeah, he was worried they were going to trigger, they were deliberately trying to trigger the
Right.
war. Eisenhower had to have his showdowns with his military too. I think the military were just in a different frame of mind then. They were still living off the fat of a post World War II era where the US could call all the shots. And that was there's been a change since then.
Well, I also think that they lived in a world where you were worried constantly that they were going to get us first before we got them.
Right, right.
And if we didn't, I mean, it was a legitimate concern, I think, that if they'd gotten those missiles in there, they could have, if they gotten the missiles into Cuba, that would have been able to bomb Moscow. We would have been a lot more vulnerable. Although we live in a world where that exists right now. I mean, they can,
Right.
if Russia wants to bomb us, they can do it from anywhere at any time. But the fear of Russian missiles in Cuba was really, really scary back then. What did you like
What
about the
did,
movie?
pardon me?
What did you like about the movie?
Well, as I said, I think the narrative, the story is what I really liked. But I'll tell you very bluntly what I didn't like.
Okay.
I didn't like Kevin Costner in this movie. I didn't like his character. I didn't like his unlikability, his boorishness, whether it's historically accurate or not. I wasn't comfortable with it. And he was acting almost like a co-president at times. And I didn't like the ham-handed interludes with his wife and his family and his personal agonistes. It almost spoiled the movie for me. But I thankfully was able to compartmentalize. What did you think of that role?
Well, one of the things I liked about, first of all, I'm not a big Kevin Costner fan. I don't think he's a very good actor. But I did appreciate the humor that he brought to it. There's this species of human beings called mass holes. It's like guys up in Massachusetts who are just kind of aggressive and very, sarcastic, and a lot of them are real sports fanatics. And I thought he did a pretty good job of articulating, what it's like to be a masshole. For example, his job is to take down the Kennedys and, take them down a peg and make sure that they, don't get too conceited. And like, for example, Ken O'Donnell decides to drive Bobby to the Soviet embassy. So he kicks the driver out and then he takes the driver's seat, and Bobby hesitates, and O'Donnell says, "What's the matter? Did you forget how to open a car door?" That's the kind of thing you'd say.
You
Or,
stole one of my favorite lines.
"Oh, sorry. All right." Or
but the thing is, Gary, I mean, I'm glad you kept this G-rated with the mass holes. But it just doesn't ring true to me, even though it might be true. The idea of him sort of stalking around the sofas in the Oval Office, where a group of really bigwigs are seated, and he's sort of lobbing pot shots into their conversation. I mean, I've been in situations where I've been the most closest person to the number one guy in the room.
yeah.
But even so, you don't act like that when you're in meetings with other people. You put on a veneer of deference and of decorum. And I just didn't, maybe it was true, but I didn't find it believable. And the other thing is, people like the Kennedys, rich, privileged celebrities, my impression is they rarely have friends who are really treated as equals. They're more like factotums or even toadies. And you can be as close as can be to a big celebrity or a big, powerful political personality. but you're not an equal. And the movie portrayed them as equals.
Well, that was probably yeah, historically inaccurate. There's this whole idea about the Irish mafia
Right.
that they
Larry
brought.
O'Brien and Kenny O'Donnell. And who was the third one? It'll come to me. But there were three of them that
Yeah,
were considered. But the one scene that Jackie Kennedy was in, near the beginning,
yeah.
the way Ted Sorensen talked to her in that scene, I just don't believe it. Now it could have been true, but it just didn't ring true. He was boorish to Jackie Kennedy.
Well, no,
I'm just
yeah. Well, you think it's boorish, but for me, I recognize that as the way people are up in
okay.
Boston.
Okay. Let me
Yeah,
say that I understand both as a filmic device and as a marketing decision. I understand why Costner was put in this role. First of all, they needed Kevin Costner's name
yeah,
on the film. He was a co-producer, and it would have been dumb for Costner to try to play one of the Kennedys.
right.
A very well-known face to try to play another very well-known face. Better to have relative unknowns playing the Kennedys or chameleons like Anthony Hopkins or Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
They might have been able to do it, but Costner's not a chameleon; he's a type. So the decision I thought made sense. It's just that I just didn't enjoy it.
I agree with you. Ken O'Donnell was probably not as mouthy he wasn't as mouthy in real life as he is in this movie. I don't think that Bobby would have stood stood for being sassed by by the appointment secretary, but they definitely try to make him into an equal. I mean, at the very last scene
Right.
there, you've got he comes to the White House, and Bobby and Jack are out in the rose garden just talking with each other, and they see Kenny and they just wave him in like, come on in. And so the movie ends with the three of them being there at the end. uh,
Yeah, and my impression of the Kennedys, especially JFK, is these were confident men,
yeah,
full of self-confidence, and yet to make Kenny look more important or more co-equal, there were those scenes where both Kennedys had their moments of big doubt, whining about things. And it might have been true with Bobby, who was more emotionally driven, but I don't believe that about JFK. In fact, Ken O'Donnell turned out to be something of a sad case. He blamed himself for the JFK assassination because he planned the trip to Dallas,
right.
the motorcade and all that. He was devastated, of course, by Bobby's death. He ran unsuccessfully twice for governor of Massachusetts. He descended into alcoholism and basically died of alcoholism at age 53, only months after his wife died of alcoholism at a young age. So it was quite a family. And the drinking was only slightly hinted at in the movie with the downing of one drink really fast toward the end. But anyway,
Well, there was a
that's
lot of
that's
drinking in
sort of the
this
story.
movie too. Did you notice
Yeah,
that they were always pouring drinks for Jack and Bobby, and he was taking them for himself? It was like it's like the kind of drinking that you see in the Nixon movies, where they're all
right, right.
there's
What
always
do you think
bad.
about some? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
What do you think about some of the other actors?
I thought that the guys who played both Bobby and JFK were I thought they were pretty good. The accents were a little off. I thought Bobby in particular, the guy who played Bobby, Stephen Culp, did a pretty good imitation. He had that rabbity look, the way that Bobby used to have. And Bruce Greenwood, who played JFK, I thought was passable, but didn't really have the gravitas that a president should have. And of course, I found out later that this was actually Joan's boyfriend in Mad Men, which is where I know him from. So
Oh, Bruce Greenwood.
Yeah, Bruce Greenwood. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I
You
knew he'd
remember
been in
that?
Mad Men, but I didn't remember which role he played. I thought they were both good. I thought I thought Greenwood sounded more like JFK than looked like him. You know, the way I'm not talking the accent, but the way the deepness of the voice, the way he vocalized comments and remarks.
Yeah.
And I thought Stephen Culp as Bobby looked more like Bobby than he sounded like him. But I thought they were both fine.
I
And
thought they
I
were.
believe them. I believe them.
Yeah. Well,
You
as I said, I
know,
believe Bobby. I didn't quite believe Greenwood, but he was fine too. I mean, again, you're just, when you have a huge movie star like Kevin Costner, who's the focus of the movie, and then you have this other guy playing JFK, it kind of overshadows him, and he just didn't seem to have the weight.
right.
I didn't have any real opinion about anyone else.
Well, I didn't care for the actors that played McNamara and Sorensen. It's not a big issue, but they both look too young,
Yeah.
and not sort of chiseled enough, haggard enough, if you will. Um, so I wasn't that impressed with them. I did like the fellow who played Adlai Stevenson, Michael Fairman, and I liked Madison Mason, who played Admiral George Anderson, the head of naval operations, who
Yeah.
had a couple important scenes in the movie, including the showdown between himself and McNamara, which really happened and basically scuttled his career going forward.
Well, he was one of the guys that was trying to bomb the Russian naval trawlers when they were being shot at, right? Is that
Yeah,
the
and basically said to the Secretary of Defense, get out of our hair, Mr. Secretary. You don't belong here. This is our job." Which was what a thing to say to the Secretary of Defense.
Well, you got the impression throughout the movie that the military thought that civilians were messing things up. But that it goes to one of my. There are a couple of things I didn't like about the movie, and one of them was that it was just hard to tell who's who. There are probably 25 different characters there, and I kept on like, who's that again? You know, the military
Yeah,
guys. I couldn't figure out like who was who, and I guess Maxwell Taylor was in the room, and we all
yeah. Is that Maxwell Taylor, or is that Dean Rusk, or is that
exactly
it was hard to keep that straight.
and every time McGeorge Bundy came on, it's like, who's that again? And McGeorge Bundy who was the national security advisor at the time, played a huge role in this Cuban Missile Crisis, and he kept on being he was just sort of a fly on the wall. Is an annoying kind of person, screwing things up in a way that Kenny O'Donnell kept on shooting him down and saying like, you're a wasp and I'm Irish and I'm going to stick with Bobby and Jack, and we've been we've the wasps and the Irish have been at it for centuries, and like, what is it talking about? I mean, I'm sure that was the last thing that was on JFK's mind, was what the religions were of the various people in the XCOM room.
Yeah, but you're right. It was hard to follow those characters. What
Um,
did you think about what's your general sense of how accurate this movie was historically?
I thought the movie was pretty close to historically accurate, in terms of this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. I agree with you completely that it was distracting to have Ken O'Donnell play the part that he did. Why do you think they did that?
Well, as I sort of mentioned, I think it was they didn't want to just do it through the eyes of JFK or Bobby.
Right.
And they needed to have Kevin Costner in the movie. It was his movie. It was a co-producer, and he was kind of the driving force behind it. And so, how do you how do you tell the story? So it was a filmic device to show it through the eyes of Sorensen. It may have been a factor that,
of O'Donnell.
I mean, of O'Donnell, yeah.
So you're
And I
getting
was,
it mixed
because
up. You know,
yeah,
Sorensen really played the role that Ken O'Donnell
exactly. And I was
is.
just going to say, it may have been, one factor may have been, I don't know this, that O'Donnell was dead when this movie was made, but Sorensen was not. And so, you're dealing with a live person versus a dead person. And the other thing, um, O'Donnell's son was an investor
Yeah,
in the movie and actually had a small part in the movie.
yeah.
It was a walk-on type part. And so I think it was both a narrative device and a marketing need to put Costner in the role he was in.
No, I think you're right. I mean, they could, of course, they could have had Sorensen. I mean, they could have had Kevin Costner playing Sorensen, I suppose. But
Right.
the I think you're right. It's the narrative device where you pick one person who plays. You consolidate all these disparate things that happen into one person, so you're following it. There was this movie about the Boston marathon bombing, and they have one cop who seems to be everywhere doing everything, and he's the one that does everything in that movie. And that's kind of the case here too. I read an essay by the author of the book that this movie is based on, and he actually didn't object to making him the focus. The argument is that because Ken O'Donnell was actually so unimportant, it doesn't make him the savior. Like if you had done this focus through Dean Rusk's eyes or through McNamara's eyes, you could have made the case that McNamara, you could have done it through his eyes. Still, I think that some of those scenes are a bit much, like when Ken O'Donnell goes to the FBI and figures out that Khrushchev and the KGB chief in the US, that they know each other from like 30 years ago or something. Or when especially this part I thought was ridiculous, when he was calling all the pilots and telling them not to get shot down, and hinting that if they did get shot at, to claim they weren't. So
Yeah.
that seemed a little bit much.
But overall, I think it laid out the history pretty well. I think it laid out the range of policy choices and military choices that JFK had.
Yeah.
It laid out the different stages of the crisis well. And I think that, that history is not so much in dispute. What's in dispute, to endless analysis, I think, is how well did Kennedy really perform in the crisis? And also, was the crisis really necessary?
Right.
Who precipitated it? Did Nikita Khrushchev precipitate it? Or did Kennedy really jump the gun and ramp it up much further and more dangerously than it needed to be? Those are things that historians are still debating, but the facts, the presentation of the facts in the movie, I think was handled pretty well.
No, I think you're right. I mean, my historical criticisms of the movie are more that they don't provide more context. They don't tell what happened before, and they don't tell what happened afterwards. Now, in a movie, that's not the movie they're making. The movie that they're making is just those 13 days. So, but they don't really explain what happened at the Bay of Pigs. That it was a humiliating thing where Kennedy allowed the military to launch this screwed up invasion of Cuba that was immediately repulsed and made us look weak. And it also certainly doesn't get into this summit that Kennedy and Khrushchev had, where Khrushchev apparently dominated Kennedy and thought he was, callow and very not very capable, and not a very
Which may have led Khrushchev to thinking he could get away with.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Why did they pull this? Because they thought they could. Right. And they probably, in those days too, you could actually sneak sneak things into Cuba and not have them detected like you would now. They didn't really have satellite technology then.
But based on the movie and based on your other reading and historical knowledge and understanding your great love for all the Kennedys, um, what's your what do you come away with as your assessment of Kennedy's leadership in this episode? It certainly helped him politically. I think first of all, it saved their ass in the midterms that were only a couple of weeks after this crisis. I mean, they did very, very well for a party in its first 2 years in the White House. They thought they got rid of Richard Nixon for good because Nixon lost the governorship of California in '62, and he blamed all the attention being sucked out of what he was trying to say, blamed it on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it helped Kennedy. I think it relieved a lot of doubts about whether he was callow and a weak leader and made him look like a strong leader. But what do you think?
Well, it is now taken as a matter of faith that the Cuban Missile Crisis was Kennedy's great foreign policy achievement, uh, because he didn't blow up the world. He stared down Russia and made the U.S. look strong. No, I also think that it was probably maybe a mistake because Khrushchev was deposed soon after this, probably because he screwed this up from the Russian perspective. And who's to know whether Khrushchev would have been a more belligerent figure or what? But Khrushchev was a person who had actually rejected Stalinism, and he might have been a Gorbachev type figure eventually if he had been allowed to stay. So I mean,
Mhm.
that's a great who knows what would have happened theory. But I mean, I guess he was um, he comes out of this looking really good. But when I'm looking at it now, 50 years later, or even 60 years later, I'm shocked that he they almost went to war over the fact that we didn't want to take our missiles out of Turkey, um, and only agreed to do it if they wouldn't tell the world. I mean, why not take those missiles out? I don't,
Yeah.
because the argument, I must say, the argument now doesn't seem as compelling that Kennedy was making,
Well,
because
because now it doesn't matter where the missiles are geographically,
I know,
for
but if
one
the
thing.
and I hate to take a communist position here, but I mean, they were unhappy that we had missiles in Turkey that could shoot into Moscow. Well, how can we justify going to war because they want to put missiles in Cuba? Why not just take them out of Cuba and Turkey both?
But the bottom line is that's what he did.
That it is what he
And
did. Yeah.
and in my reading, along with watching this movie, I've come to the conclusion that he showed pretty good judgment. He laid out his objectives from the very outset. We want the offensive missiles and care about defensive. We want the offensive missiles out of Cuba, and we don't want a nuclear war.
Right.
And he never allowed the mission creep that was being urged on him, not only by the military, but by Bobby, who blew hot and cold on that over the crisis, and by other aides. And he sort of kept his wits about him in
Yeah.
terms of and he finally, it's sort of a light bulb went on, and he said, "Are we really going to blow up the world over 15 obsolete, inferior missiles in Turkey?
Yeah.
Hell no." And so it may have been a meandering course, but he came to the right conclusion. And I think now we can look back and say, maybe why couldn't he just have engaged the Russians in a series of negotiations over that without the histrionics of a nationwide speech and all that? and the laying down of the threats. But it was understandable at the time. And I have to say, this is one reason I think he acted like Eisenhower would have acted. And it's one of the reasons why I think ultimately he was a pretty good president. You know, Henry Luce, who started Time magazine, he famously said of JFK, "We don't know whether he's the beginning of something new or the end of something old."
Yeah.
And sadly to me, I think he was the end of something old. I've said it before. I think there was a continuum between Eisenhower and JFK, and things didn't really start changing and going to hell until November 22nd.
Well, if and when we get to the JFK movie, the movie JFK, it's also starring Kevin Costner.
Right. And you
We
won't
get,
like his accent there either. What were your favorite scenes?
oh, can I just say one more thing about the
Yeah.
history? A thread that goes through this movie and through the Missiles of October is this Barbara Tuchman book, The Guns of August, which is about how World War II was triggered by the rules of engagement within all the countries of Europe.
Was it World War I or World War II?
Oh, sorry, yeah,
The Guns
World
of
War One,
August.
obviously,
Yeah.
yeah. There's, have you read it? It's a pretty good.
No, I'd like to because
Yeah,
it
it's a
was
very
referenced.
interesting book about about the beginning of World War One and about how both sides were so poised, and they all had the so-called rules of engagement. You hear this term rules of engagement throughout this movie because they want to make sure that because it's a callback to what happened in Europe, where each side was poised to do certain things if the other side did something. So once the trigger got going, it was a domino effect where one country had to mobilize and the other country had to mobilize, and they were never able to call everyone back. And so what Kennedy had apparently read this book and was very influenced by it and knew that he couldn't, he didn't want the same thing to happen where,
Right.
and we see that in a couple of times where, the generals say our rules of engagement are that if we get shot at, we shoot back. And then, thus begins this, and Kennedy's like, no, don't, don't,
Right.
don't do that.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And now I get one more little bit of history.
Okay.
And that is one of the reasons Kennedy got the reputation of being the winner in the Cuban Missile Crisis and Khrushchev, the guy that blinked, is because the Turkey deal was kept secret until 1989. That's remarkable. In other words, it was not till 1989 that it became publicly known that Kennedy had also given away on Turkey.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know
I just,
that. I thought I'd known that longer ago, but
yeah, no.
okay. All right, my favorite scenes. I hate to say it, but one of my favorite scenes was Adlai Stevenson at the UN Security Council when he confronts the lying Soviet UN ambassador about having missiles there.
Great scene.
I've seen the actual footage of this on TV, and it seems like a word for word recreation. I'm a little annoyed at the way they set it up, though, with Bobby, like almost pulling him out and putting someone else in. And then being surprised and delighted at what Stevenson said, as if all that hadn't been prepared ahead of time, including, I
Yeah.
mean, where do they think all these big photographs come from? Do you think he just sort of they ended up materialized out of fresh air? But so I like that scene.
That was good.
How about you? What did you have a favorite
Well,
scene?
there was one little snippet of a scene I thought was hilarious, and that's when JFK wanted to stay in the White House and not go on his previously planned
Oh, yeah.
trips. And he wanted to cancel on Mayor Richard Daley, who was probably the reason Kennedy was president, in more ways than one. And he talked really tough about, just call him and tell him that I'm not coming. And O'Donnell says, okay, you call him and tell him. And then the very next scene, JFK is standing in Chicago
Yeah.
with Daley. I thought that.
Well, but that is a good example, though, of how it's probably unlikely that Ken O'Donnell would have been mouthing off to the president, like, just say, well, you call him. Now, he's like, are you afraid? Kennedy says, are you afraid to call him? And he says, yeah, I am afraid to call him. You call him. And right, the next day he's right there.
It
That is
was
a
a
good
great
scene.
little scene. And then, as I mentioned before, I really liked the when the embargo or the quarantine was first being put into force. I really liked the back and forth between the ships in the Caribbean and then the White House, the tension back and forth.
Yeah.
I thought that was really well done. And I thought the Bobby and Dobrynin scene was pretty good too.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. And I know that you hated this scene, but I thought it was actually pretty effective when when he's driving Bobby to the Soviet embassy, and Bobby needs a little bucking up, and Bobby says, I hate being called the brilliant one, the ruthless one. And he's like, well, maybe the ruthless one.
Yeah.
But obviously that scene is completely fiction. Do you have any
Right.
other? You have favorite lines?
Yes, I do. I thought the when General Curtis LeMay said in an almost insulting, kind of tone to the president, "You're in a real fix," and
Yeah,
JFK just fired back, "Well, you're in it with us." I like
yeah,
that line.
yeah,
And then I thought I liked Adlai Stevenson's line when he said, "Well, one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess I'll be the one." He was the dove in the film.
right.
And then when the admiral, who was in charge of naval operations, said to JFK in a sort of sing-songy manner, taking his instructions, "The Navy won't let you down, sir." And then JFK's had a great reaction. It was like a grimace, a slight grimace. And to me, that reminded me of probably his experiences in the Navy with PT 109 and
Right,
how
right.
he hated the bureaucracy of the Navy and they didn't come and look for he and his crew. I just thought that was a great exchange.
Yeah. No,
How about
that's
you? I got a
yeah,
couple
no.
more, but your turn.
Yeah, okay. This is not my favorite line, but did you notice that the first spoken word of dialogue in the movie is when Kevin Costner finds his son underneath the bed and he says, "Who's that? You're dead." Is like,
Oh my God.
like, oh boy, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean that sort of sets the tone for what's going to happen. I thought Kevin Costner's line where he tells the president, there's no experts in these scenarios, no wise old men, there's just us. And I think that's
Yeah.
probably the case. I mean, when you're in a leadership role, you realize that no one's going to come to your rescue. You just have to figure it out yourself.
Well, that conjures up another one of my favorites was when Kennedy looked at his team of aides and he said, "Gentlemen, if anyone's got any great ideas, now's the time." And there was dead silence,
Yeah,
from the team that was heralded later as the best and the brightest.
right,
Dead,
right.
dead silence from the best and the brightest. I thought that was a good one. And then, speaking of the best and the brightest, at the very end, after some of the aides were chortling over making the Russians blink, and Maxwell Taylor in a gloating tone said, "Now we can run the table in Southeast Asia." Oh my God. Oh my God.
But my actual favorite line is, Kennedy, President Kennedy says, things couldn't get much worse, and Ken O'Donnell says, "Oh, I don't know, we could go down to Lyndon's ranch again and dress up like cowboys and shoot deer out of his convertible."
That was a great
Which,
one.
did you notice that Lyndon was in the last scene of well, not the last scene, but like after everyone's like whooping it up, all of a sudden Lyndon Johnson is there. He doesn't appear in those scenes at all. I mean, he's part of that. He was part of those meetings.
Right. And he appeared more in the TikTok version I read in the Reeves book. And he was one who was sort of clarifying the issues. He didn't have anything new to offer, but he kept saying, our boys should not be killed and we should not go to nuclear war over 15 missiles in Turkey. It was sort of the clarifying,
Yeah.
crystallizing the what was at stake. I like some of Kennedy's lines in his famous American University speech,
Yeah.
which occurred shortly before his death, and where he basically tried to set a new tone for Soviet relations. And that speech, by the way, provides some of the opening lines in the JFK movie, as you'll find out.
What do you think the movie's trying to accomplish here?
Um, I think it's, first of all, Hollywood loves Armageddon movies,
Yeah.
movies that portray the end of the world. Now they're all about how climate change is going to cause the end of the world.
Either that
But
or
in those,
superheroes.
right, right. And I think it was just trying to show, it was trying to say to us, why not look at a real example
Yeah.
instead of the fantasy ones that we Hollywood are so famous at coming up with?
I think I think you're right about that. And also I think this reminded me of Spielberg's Lincoln, which is a deep dive into an intense few weeks in American history. And like Lincoln, it has a thesis about presidential leadership.
Yeah,
Spielberg emphasizes the ability to compromise, but the screenwriters of 13 Days want to emphasize the importance of politics in governing. I mean, you keep on hearing the word politics a lot through this. Ken O'Donnell says, everything. Ken O'Donnell sees everything through a political lens, everything from who should be invited to the Jackie's parties to whether you can trust that CIA agent. And it seems to say that a good leader will recognize his most loyal supporters and keep them close. So I think he's a way of thinking that leadership is all about pulling the strings in politics in a way that um, like if you're a speechwriter, sometimes you think that the most important thing in leadership is communications and oral things. He's a political guy and he thinks everything's political.
right. Yeah. I don't think, there's a long history of the lionization of the
Oh yeah.
Kennedys.
Yeah.
And I think there was some of that, but it wasn't overdone.
Yeah,
I
it
don't
isn't
think it
the
was
usual.
overdone.
Yeah, I was going to say it isn't the usual hagiographic thing you get. Ken
Right.
O'Donnell, by the way, speaking of that, I was going to say Ken O'Donnell wrote, um, co-wrote, Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, which
Right.
is a book that I would never read, but the title is something that I often say sarcastically whenever someone gets, even a baseball player gets thrown out of a game. It's like, you know, uh, Carlos, we hardly knew ye, because it's just corniest phrase.
How about relevance for today? What do you think this?
I think the issue of projecting strength and weakness in foreign affairs is always relevant. So I think the movie was completely relevant.
Yeah, I do
You know,
too.
people who are viewing, people are still today viewing politics through Great Britain's appeasement policies before World War II, which informed a lot of the thinking here during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The thought is that it made Hitler confident that he could get away with everything because they kept on conceding things. And in fact, even today, there are some who argue that if we hadn't withdrawn so precipitously from Afghanistan, Putin wouldn't have thought the U.S. and NATO would let him stand by and invade Ukraine. So
Yeah, everybody's invoking the Ukraine situation and applying it to the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis on all sides of the
yeah,
Ukraine question, and but putting aside, the agendas, the movie does show how things can escalate, how battlefield mistakes, miscommunications can trigger a wider war than anyone really wants, and I have to say, without we're not going to do any deep dive into the Ukraine thing, but in terms of preventing us from skidding our way into an all-out war with Russia, Who would you rather have in charge? John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, or Joseph R. Biden Jr. and Vladimir Putin? Holy cow.
Yeah. And the thing about the movie is it does make a good point about the importance of communication. But in a way, and because they didn't have a hotline back then, there was no way for the president and the Soviet leader to talk. So you have all these back channel things, and there's all these weird signaling things like,
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought about the
yeah,
hotline.
yeah, because exactly because it was so unclear. Now, in a way, you can have all the communication you want if, which we do now. I mean, um, but the leaders are not wise or don't believe what's being told to them. It doesn't really matter.
It's also interesting how in these confrontations, people are still trying to do things secretly.
Yeah.
So it took some low life leaker who wanted to show off to his friends to, let us know that we actually have ground special ops troops in Ukraine
Yeah.
fighting alongside Ukrainians who are killing Russians.
Could this movie be made today?
Yeah, I mean, it would probably be manipulated by too many message for today people with too many agendas. But instead of just rolling out the history of the crisis back then and letting people draw their own lessons and extrapolations. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think you could easily make the same movie today. It hasn't aged at all. And I think it would be even better received today than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, definitely.
If you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it would be a great way to introduce the students to what happened then and to engage them in a discussion about who was right and who was wrong. Did the crisis have to happen? Could such a thing happen today? Yeah.
And your grade for the movie?
B plus. It would have been not just an A minus, but an A if it had a more muted and realistic role for the Costner O'Donnell character. But I'd recommend it. I definitely recommend this movie.
Yeah, I would have
How
given
about
it.
you?
I give it an A minus. And again, I cannot understand why this movie is not better known or better wasn't better received. I mean, it's a totally decent movie.
Sure.
But there you go. Do we have any closing thoughts? Anything you want to say about this movie?
No, I think this is a very there are some of the movies we've done where have I liked it because I'm in a niche and I liked it for, like the Nixon movie. And that's just me. So I just am so enthused about that. But this one, I would recommend to anybody. I think it's a very, very high quality film.
And I will say that the only thing I would say if they made it again today, they might make it a Netflix series and do it over like six, or God forbid they did it over 13 episodes. But I think it benefited from being so concise, only 2 hours. Maybe they skimped on history a little bit here and there and nuance, but I think that story is pretty effectively told in 2.5 hours. If you I don't even think it's 2.5 hours. If you
I think it's 220 or something like that.
Yeah, you can tell a story in that short amount of time if you're economical with your dialogue and your shots.
So I want you to think back, Gary, and try to remember the crisis when it actually happened, because you're so precocious now. You must have really been a precocious child, and I can't believe that you didn't remember it as it was happening.
I know. It's really weird. I will say this, that my parents we did not watch TV news at all. And that might be part of the reason. And I wasn't reading the newspapers then. So I don't know, but I don't remember it. So I just want to emphasize to everyone that this podcast is available on Amazon, Spotify, Apple, and most platforms. So subscribe there so that I don't have to send it out to all you guys and my friends and and make you click on the link. Um, if you have comments, we do have a Facebook page called The Celluloid President, or you can just email me at garyholmes76@gmail.com. And I think that's it, Jim, right?
That's it. We promise never to make our podcast as long as the movie itself, although we come close.
Well, this one is the shortest one yet. So congratulations
Yay.
to us. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.